Snow had covered nearly every corner of Cedar Hollow when a former Navy SEAL came home after 23 years away. He wasn't looking for answers, and he certainly wasn't looking for a dog. But behind a rusted fence stood an aging German shepherd who refused to leave an abandoned house. Day after day, storm after storm, the dog kept watch over a door that never opened. The town had its opinions, its rumors, and its regrets, but none could explain why he stayed. What began as curiosity soon led the Navy SEAL into a story of loyalty, sacrifice, and a man almost everyone had misunderstood. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and if stories like this mean something to you, please like, comment, and subscribe to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, so we can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this one. By the time Mason Crow crossed the town limits of Cedar Hollow, the daylight was already fading into a pale winter gray. Snow covered everything: the roofs, the fences, the empty baseball field near the highway. Even the old welcome sign looked tired beneath the weight of the season. 23 years. That was how long he had stayed away. Long enough for the town to forget his face. Long enough for him to forget what it felt like to belong anywhere. The pickup truck rolled slowly down Main Street. Most of the storefronts looked smaller than he remembered. A few had disappeared entirely. The hardware store where his father used to buy fishing gear had become a coffee shop. The movie theater stood empty behind plywood-covered windows. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Mason parked in front of the small house that had belonged to his parents. The place looked lonely. A thin layer of snow rested on the porch railing. Wind pushed loose flakes across the driveway. He sat behind the steering wheel for several seconds before stepping out. The cold hit immediately. Sharp. Clean. The kind of cold that made a person feel awake whether they wanted to or not. His boots crunched against the snow as he walked toward the front door. This wasn't home anymore. It was a task, a responsibility, something to finish before moving on. At least that was what he kept telling himself. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar wood and old memories. Boxes waited in every room. Furniture covered with sheets stood like silent ghosts. Mason spent most of the afternoon sorting paperwork, insurance, documents, tax records, photographs, letters, the ordinary remains of ordinary lives. As darkness settled outside the windows, he finally stopped. His neck ached, his eyes felt heavy. He slipped on his olive jacket and decided to walk through town before turning in for the night. The air outside had grown colder. Streetlights cast long amber reflections across the snow-covered sidewalks. For a while, he walked without purpose, past houses he barely recognized, past yards where children once played, past memories that no longer belonged to him. Then he heard it, clink. A soft, metallic sound, almost swallowed by the wind. He stopped. Listened. Silence. A few seconds later, clink. The sound came from somewhere behind a row of aging houses. Mason followed it. Not because he was curious. At least, that was what he told himself. The noise led him to a narrow alley buried beneath fresh snow. At the end stood a weathered property surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The house looked abandoned. Dark windows. Sagging porch. Paint peeling from the siding. Everything about it suggested neglect. Then he saw the dog. A German shepherd stood near the back steps, motionless. Snow rested across its back and shoulders. The animal didn't seem to notice. Its gaze remained fixed on the rear door of the house, waiting, watching, as if someone might step outside at any moment. Mason approached the fence slowly. The dog turned its head. One amber eye reflected the light from a nearby street lamp. The other remained hidden in shadow. Old. That was the first thing Mason noticed. The gray around the muzzle, the stiffness in its posture, the slight tremor in its back leg. Yet there was still strength inside it. A stubborn strength. The kind that refused to surrender simply because time demanded it. The chain attached to its collar moved slightly. Clink. There was the sound again. The dog stared at Mason for several long seconds. Not hostile, not welcoming, just measuring him. Then it turned back toward the door. Mason found himself staring, too, at the dark doorway, at the porch light that hadn't worked in years, at a house that looked as though it had been holding its breath. A strange feeling settled over him, something he couldn't explain. He left after a few minutes. Yet even as he walked away, he kept glancing back. The dog never moved, not once. The next morning, snow continued to fall. Mason woke early. Military habits died hard. After coffee, he found himself walking the same route as the night before. He told himself he was simply stretching his legs. Nothing more. The dog was still there. Same spot, same posture, as though the entire night had passed around him without consequence. This time, someone else stood near the fence. An elderly woman bundled in a burgundy winter coat. Her silver curls peeked from beneath a knitted hat. She carried a metal bowl. The dog accepted the food politely. No excitement, no wagging tail, just quiet acceptance. The woman noticed Mason approaching. "You saw him yesterday, didn't you?" she asked. Mason nodded. "I did," she sighed softly. "Most people do eventually." The woman introduced herself as Martha Keegan. Her face carried the kind of warmth that comes from years of caring for others. Even in the cold, there was something comforting about her presence. She glanced toward the dog. "His name's Atlas." The name seemed oddly fitting, strong, steady, ancient. "How long has he been here?" Mason asked. Martha hesitated. "Over a year." Mason frowned. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." The answer sat heavily between them. Over a year. The number made no sense. No dog should still be standing in the same place after that long. No dog should still be waiting. Martha brushed snow from her gloves. "I bring him food every day." "You take care of him?" "I try." The woman looked toward the abandoned house. "I've tried taking him home. Tried letting him stay in my garage during storms." A sad smile appeared. "He always comes back." Atlas finished eating. Instead of looking at Martha, he returned his attention to the back door. Waiting, always waiting. For the first time, Mason noticed the old brass tag hanging from the collar. A small compass, worn smooth by years of use. The sight triggered something unexpected. A memory, a flash of sand. Heat, helicopter rotors. A military working dog running through dust wrecks. For a moment, Mason forgot where he was, forgot the snow, forgot the town, forgot the years. He remembered kneeling beside Rex after the mission. Remembered the silence afterward. Remembered the feeling that he should have done more, saved more, been faster. Better, the guilt had never fully disappeared. It simply learned how to hide. When the memory faded, Atlas was still standing there, quiet, patient. The same way Rex had often stood watch before dawn patrols. Something tightened in Mason's chest. He hated the feeling because he recognized it. Attachment, the beginning of it, and attachment always came with a price. "You don't have to keep coming back," Martha said gently. Mason looked at her. "What?" She smiled knowingly. "I've seen that look before." "What look?" "The one people get when they start worrying about him." Mason almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "I was just curious." "Of course." Martha's smile widened. Neither of them believed it. A gust of wind swept through the yard. Snow drifted across Atlas's paws. The dog never moved. Mason studied him one last time. The folded ear, the weathered collar, the stubborn posture. Most of all, the unwavering focus on that door. Whatever kept Atlas here wasn't hunger. It wasn't fear. It wasn't habit alone. It was something deeper. Something powerful enough to hold a living creature in place for more than a year. And for reasons Mason couldn't yet understand, he suddenly wanted to know what that something was, not tomorrow, not eventually now. Atlas finally turned his head. Their eyes met, only for a second. Then the dog looked away again, as if the decision wasn't his to make, as if Mason would have to earn whatever answers waited behind that silent door. The snow continued to fall. Neither of them moved. And for the first time since returning to Cedar Hollow, Mason felt something other than obligation keeping him there. For the next 3 days, Mason told himself he was staying busy. There was plenty to do. The house needed sorting. Paperwork needed signatures. A realtor was waiting for answers. Yet somehow, each morning and each afternoon, his boots found their way back to the same street, the same fence, the same abandoned house, and the same German shepherd. Atlas had become part of the landscape, like the bare maple tree in the front yard, like the sagging porch. Like the snow piled against the foundation, the dog no longer seemed strange. That was what troubled Mason. It should have felt strange. No living creature should spend day after day staring at a closed door. Yet the longer he watched Atlas, the more it seemed natural, as if waiting had become the dog's profession, its purpose, its reason for waking up each morning. One afternoon, Mason brought a folding chair. Martha laughed when she saw him setting it beside the fence. "I suppose curiosity's gotten serious now." Mason shrugged. "It's a free country. That's what all the stubborn men say." The old woman handed him a thermos of coffee. The steam drifted upward into the winter air. For several minutes neither spoke. Atlas remained near the back steps, watching, listening, existing inside a world nobody else seemed able to enter. Finally, Mason asked the question that had been growing in his mind. What happened to his owner? Martha's smile faded. The change was subtle but unmistakable. "You mean Warren?" Mason nodded. For a moment she seemed to search for the right words. Then she simply sighed. "That's complicated." "How so?" Martha stared toward the house. "Depends who you ask." That answer lingered with Mason long after he left, because it wasn't the answer itself. It was the way she had said it, as if Warren Doyle was not merely absent, as if he had become something else, a story, a disagreement, a wound the town hadn't fully healed. The following morning, Mason walked into a small diner on Main Street. The place smelled of bacon grease and coffee. Most of the customers appeared old enough to remember the town before the interstate arrived. A few glanced toward him. Some recognized the Crow name. Most didn't. He ordered breakfast and listened. Small towns always talked. You simply had to stay quiet long enough. Eventually someone mentioned Warren Doyle. The conversation changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. Like a door gently closing. One man shook his head. Another looked out the window. A third muttered something about troublemakers. Then the topic vanished. Mason noticed. More importantly, everyone else seemed to notice that he noticed. The silence became more revealing than any answer. Later that afternoon, and he found himself standing inside the local hardware store. The place looked as though it hadn't changed since 1985. Wooden floors creaked. Dust floated through sunlight. An elderly cashier sat behind the register reading a newspaper. When Mason mentioned Warren Doyle, the man folded the paper slowly. "Warren, huh? You knew him?" "Knew of him." The answer came carefully, measured. "People around here have opinions." "What kind?" The cashier chuckled. "The kind that last longer than they should." Before Mason could ask more, another customer entered, and the conversation ended. Again, another door closing. Another answer that wasn't really an answer. That evening he returned to Atlas. The dog was standing farther down the fence line than usual. Snow crunched beneath Mason's boots. Atlas glanced toward him, then returned his attention to the house. Mason leaned against the fence. "Your owner wasn't very popular." Atlas remained silent. Of course he did. Yet speaking aloud somehow made the situation feel less ridiculous. The dog shifted slightly, just enough to reveal something beneath the snow, an old wooden post, weathered by years of storms. Carved into its surface were several marks, deep grooves, lines cut by hand. Mason crouched beside it. Some of the carvings looked recent, others looked decades old. There were initials, dates, tiny notches, a history recorded in wood. The lowest carving caught his eye. WD beside it sat a second set of markings, cruder, rougher, 4 small scratches arranged in a pattern, paw marks. Atlas watched him. Not the house, not the door, him, for the first time, only for a moment. Then the dog turned away again. But something had changed. A tiny shift, almost invisible, yet enough for Mason to notice. The distance between them had narrowed, not because Atlas approached, because Atlas no longer ignored him completely. The realization stayed with Mason all evening. 2 days later, Martha directed him toward a small veterans' hall near the edge of town. "If anybody remembers Warren honestly," she said, "it'll be someone there." The building sat beside an old frozen field. Flags fluttered weakly in the wind. Inside, the hall felt warmer than expected. Photographs covered the walls. Military portraits, fundraisers, fishing tournaments, decades of shared history. A handful of older men sat around a card table. One of them immediately stood out, not because he was loud, because he wasn't. The man sat quietly near the corner, tall despite his age, broad-shouldered beneath a worn denim jacket. His silver mustache was neatly trimmed. Deep lines crossed his face, the kind earned through time rather than anger. When Mason introduced himself, the man's expression changed, recognition. Not of Mason, of the name. "Crow," he repeated, "I remember, your father." The man extended his hand, Hank Morales. The handshake was firm. Neither man tried to prove anything. Both had long outgrown that stage of life. They sat together near the coffee machine. For nearly an hour they spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the lake, the shrinking population. Only eventually did Mason mention Warren. The change in Hank was immediate, not defensive, not hostile, just tired, as though he had carried a heavy memory for too many years. "You knew him?" Hank stared into his coffee. "Long time ago." "Friends?" The old man smiled without humor. "Something like that." "What happened?" For several moments Hank said nothing. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Finally he answered, "We stopped speaking." "Why?" Hank rubbed a hand across his jaw. "Because both of us were stubborn." The answer surprised Mason. No anger, no accusation, just regret. What kind of man was he? Hank considered the question carefully, long enough that Mason wondered if he would answer at all. Then he nodded toward the window. "You see that lake?" Mason followed his gaze. "I do. Warren loved this town more than anybody I ever met." Doesn't sound like a bad quality. It isn't. Hank's eyes remained fixed on the snow-covered landscape. But sometimes people love something so much, they stop knowing how to live with everyone else. The words hung in the air. Mason waited, expecting more. None came. Instead, Hank stood. The conversation was over, at least for now. Before leaving, however, the old veteran paused. Warren wasn't what people say. Mason looked up. "What do people say?" Hank gave a sad smile. "Depends who's talking." The answer echoed Martha's words almost exactly. Then Hank walked away, leaving Mason alone with more questions than before. That night, Mason returned to the abandoned house. The moon reflected off fresh snow. Atlas stood exactly where he always stood. Yet somehow the dog seemed less mysterious now. Not because Mason understood him. Because he understood the people around him. Every mention of Warren created hesitation. Every memory carried weight. Every answer seemed tangled inside something unfinished. Atlas wasn't the only one refusing to move on. The entire town appeared trapped in its own version of waiting. Mason rested his arms on the fence. The dog glanced toward him. This time neither looked away immediately. The moment lasted longer than before. Two strangers measuring each other. One man, one aging dog. Both standing in the cold because something from the past still refused to release its grip. For the first time, Mason realized he wasn't simply interested in Atlas anymore. He wanted to understand Warren Doyle. And the more people avoided talking about him, the more certain Mason became that the truth was worth finding. The snowstorm arrived before dawn. Mason woke to the sound of wind scraping across the windows of his parents' old house. For a few moments he forgot where he was. Then the silence reminded him. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The hollow kind. The kind that settled into empty rooms after everyone who mattered was gone. He pulled on a sweater and walked into the kitchen. The coffee maker rattled to life. Outside, Cedar Hollow had nearly disappeared beneath fresh snow. The town looked untouched, as though the storm had erased every footprint made the day before, including his own. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, his thoughts drifted back to Hank Morales, to the way the old veteran had spoken about Warren, not with anger, not with admiration, but with unfinished regret. That bothered Mason more than open hostility ever could. People usually hated others for clear reasons. Regret was different. Regret meant there had once been something worth losing. 3 days later, the storm finally broke. Life slowly returned to the streets. Snowplows cleared the roads. Shop owners shoveled sidewalks. Children's laughter occasionally echoed from distant yards. Mason spent the morning sorting through boxes in his parents' attic. Most contained nothing important. Old holiday decorations, broken fishing gear, photographs fading at the edges. Near the back of a closet he found a cardboard box filled with newspapers. The papers dated back more than 20 years. At first he planned to throw them away. Then one headline caught his eye. Local veteran, encored for bravery overseas. The accompanying photograph showed several soldiers standing beside a military transport vehicle. Mason stared. The image felt strangely familiar. Not because he recognized every face, because he recognized one face, his own, much younger, much thinner. The article described a rescue operation during his final years in service. The story credited another man for pulling him from a collapsed structure during enemy fire. A man named Daniel Mercer. Mason frowned. For years he had believed that story. Everyone had, including him. He folded the newspaper and carried it downstairs. Something about it felt wrong. Not factually wrong. Emotionally wrong. Like a puzzle piece that fit poorly despite appearing correct. That afternoon he drove to the Veterans Hall. The parking lot contained only a handful of vehicles. Inside, Hank Morales sat alone at a table near the window. A cup of coffee rested beside a stack of crossword puzzles. The old man glanced up as Mason entered. "You again? Sorry to disappoint you." Hank smirked. "I've survived worse." Mason sat across from him. For a while neither spoke. Years in uniform had taught both men that silence wasn't always uncomfortable. Eventually, Mason unfolded the newspaper. "I found this." Hank adjusted his glasses. His eyes narrowed as he read the article. Then he leaned back slowly. A shadow crossed his expression, one that Mason immediately noticed. "You've seen it before." Hank nodded. "Many times." Mason tapped the photograph. "The story says Mercer saved me." "It does. You don't sound convinced." The old veteran looked toward the window. Outside, sunlight reflected off the snow-covered field. Everything seemed brighter than usual. Yet Hank appeared older than before, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "There are official stories," he said quietly. "And then there are the stories people actually carry." Mason waited. Hank rubbed his hands together. The gesture wasn't nervous. It felt more like preparation, as if opening a door he had kept shut for years. "You really don't remember that day?" Mason shook his head. "Not much. Head injuries do that." The room fell silent. Finally, Hank exhaled. "Mercer got the credit because he stayed with you afterward." Mason frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means somebody else got to you first." A strange sensation moved through Mason's chest. Not shock, not yet. something closer to anticipation, the feeling that accompanies an answer arriving after a very long journey. Hank's eyes met his. Warren Doyle. The name landed heavily. Mason said nothing. For a moment, even the sounds of the building seemed distant. Warren found you, Hank continued. He crawled into that structure when everybody else thought it would collapse again. Mason stared at him. Why wasn't it reported? Hank laughed softly, without humor. Because Warren didn't care. What? He never corrected anybody. The answer felt impossible. Why not? Because that's who he was. The revelation followed Mason home. Not dramatically, not like lightning. More like a slow crack spreading through ice. All afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at old photographs, trying to remember, trying to reconstruct pieces of a day that existed mostly as fragments. Dust, noise, heat, the smell of smoke, a hand grabbing his tactical vest, a voice shouting, then darkness, nothing clear enough to trust, nothing solid enough to hold. For 25 years, he had carried gratitude toward a man he barely knew. Written Christmas cards, sent occasional messages, even attended a retirement ceremony. All because he believed Daniel Mercer had saved his life. Now that certainty had begun to crumble, and beneath it stood a name nobody in Cedar Hollow wanted to discuss. Warren Doyle. Late that evening, Mason walked to the abandoned house. Atlas stood in his usual place. The dog looked up when he approached. Not surprised, almost as though he had expected him. The wind had eased. The night felt unusually still. Mason stopped beside the fence. For several minutes he simply stood there, studying the old German shepherd, the silver around the muzzle, the folded ear, the worn brass compass hanging from the collar. Eventually he spoke. Did he ever tell anybody? Atlas remained silent. Mason laughed quietly. I'm asking the wrong witness. The dog slowly approached the fence, closer than ever before. Not much. Only a few feet. Yet, it was the first time Atlas had crossed that invisible boundary he seemed to maintain. Mason didn't reach toward him, didn't call his name, didn't try to force trust. He simply remained where he was. After a long moment, Atlas lowered his head. The old compass tag tapped softly against the fence wire. A small sound, barely noticeable. Yet something about it struck Mason deeply. Because for the first time the dog wasn't watching the house. He was watching Mason. The moment lasted only seconds. Then Atlas stepped back, returning to his usual place. But the distance between them had changed again. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. Near midnight, he climbed into the attic, searching for something. Anything. A memory, a photograph, a connection. Instead, he found an old military yearbook tucked between storage boxes. Its cover was worn. The pages smelled faintly of dust and paper. He turned them slowly. Faces, names, units, history frozen in print. Then he found it, a group photograph. Young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. Among them stood Warren Doyle. Younger, broader, very much alive. Mason stared at the image. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed something else. A handwritten note along the bottom margin. Not from Warren, from his father. The words had faded but remained readable. One sentence, just 6 words. The best man nobody understood. Mason read the line twice, then a third time, outside. Snow began falling again. Softly, quietly. He sat there for a long time holding the photograph. Not because he had found answers, because he finally understood how many questions remained. And for the first time since returning to Cedar Hollow, Warren Doyle no longer felt like a mystery from somebody else's life. He felt connected, personal. As if the forgotten man and the waiting dog had somehow been walking toward Mason long before he ever came home. The discovery should have given Mason peace. Instead, it left him restless. For days, the truth about Warren Doyle lingered in the back of his mind like a song he couldn't finish hearing. The man had saved his life. The fact itself was simple. What wasn't simple was everything surrounding it. Why had Warren never spoken about it? Why had his father written those words beneath the photograph? Why did half the town seem uncomfortable whenever his name appeared? Questions multiplied faster than answers. And strangely, Atlas remained at the center of all of them. Not because the dog revealed anything, but because Atlas was the only thing Warren had left behind that still seemed alive, still active, still following some invisible purpose. One cold morning, Mason arrived at the fence carrying a paper bag from the diner. Atlas looked at him briefly, then turned away. Mason sat on an overturned bucket near the fence and ate his breakfast. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. The dog stood quietly. The house remained silent. The town slowly woke around them. Then Atlas moved, not toward the house, not toward Mason, away. The old German shepherd began walking down the side of the property, slowly, deliberately, without hesitation. Mason watched him disappear around the corner. That alone wasn't unusual. Dogs moved around, dogs explored. Yet something about Atlas's pace felt different, purposeful, almost scheduled. The kind of movement that came from repetition. The kind created by habit. Without thinking too much about it, Mason stood and followed. Atlas crossed 3 side streets before reaching the edge of town. The route wasn't random. He never paused to sniff, never wandered, never changed direction. The old dog walked as though he had traveled the path hundreds of times before. Snow crunched beneath his paws. A thin mist rose from the frozen ground. Mason stayed well behind, not wanting to interrupt, not wanting to influence whatever this was. The farther they traveled, the more Cedar Hollow faded behind them. Soon the houses disappeared. Then the roads. Only open land remained. Fields. Trees. White silence stretching beneath a pale winter sky. Atlas continued. Eventually they reached a ridge overlooking the northern shoreline of the lake. The dog stopped. For several moments he simply stood there, watching. Mason followed his gaze. Nothing appeared unusual. A frozen shoreline, clusters of reeds, snow-covered rocks, the distant outline of mountains. Yet Atlas remained completely focused, as though checking on something, or remembering something. After a while he turned and continued walking. The routine repeated itself twice more that morning. Different locations, different stops. Always the same behavior. Arrive, observe, move on. When Atlas finally returned to the abandoned house nearly 2 hours later, Mason felt strangely exhausted. The dog, meanwhile, settled beside the back steps as though he had merely completed another ordinary day. That evening, Mason described the experience to Martha. The elderly woman listened carefully while arranging boxes at the church food pantry, where she volunteered twice a week. The building smelled faintly of coffee and canned soup. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the windows. "That doesn't surprise me," she said. "You've seen him do it?" "Many times." Mason looked up. "You never mentioned it. You never asked." "Fair enough." Martha smiled softly. "Warren used to take him everywhere, every single day." She sealed a cardboard box and continued. "People thought Warren walked Atlas because he loved dogs, didn't he?" "Oh, he did." Her smile widened. "But that wasn't the whole reason." Mason waited. Martha folded her hands together. "He said a place only stays important if somebody keeps showing up." The sentence lingered. Simple, yet somehow profound. Mason found himself thinking about it long after leaving. The next morning he followed Atlas again. And the morning after that, patterns slowly emerged. The dog wasn't wandering. He was making rounds, like a watchman or a caretaker. Every stop held something in common: water, trees, wildlife, areas most people ignored. One location overlooked a frozen creek. Another bordered a marsh hidden behind dense pines. A third sat beside an old nesting area overlooking the lake. Atlas never rushed, never lingered too long. Only enough time to look, then move on. The realization arrived gradually. These weren't random destinations. They were checkpoints. On the fourth day, Atlas stopped at a weathered structure partially hidden among the trees. At first Mason thought it was an abandoned hunting shed. The roof sagged beneath accumulated snow. One window had been boarded shut. The door hung slightly crooked. Atlas approached without hesitation. Mason followed. Inside, the space felt surprisingly organized. Dust covered everything, yet nothing appeared abandoned. Shelves lined the walls. Maps were pinned to bulletin boards. Weather journals filled cardboard boxes. Stacks of notebooks sat carefully arranged near an old desk. Mason stared. The room felt less like a shed, more like a workspace, a headquarters, the place where someone had spent years paying attention. Atlas walked directly to the far corner and lay down, comfortably, familiar, at home. For the first time since meeting the dog, Mason understood something important. Atlas wasn't returning here because he missed Warren. Not entirely. He returned because this place was still part of his life, part of his routine, part of his identity. The realization shifted something inside Mason. Until now, he had viewed Atlas mainly through the lens of loss, an old dog waiting for a man who would never return. But perhaps that wasn't the whole story. Perhaps Atlas wasn't trapped in the past. Perhaps he was continuing it. Among the shelves, Mason discovered dozens of field notebooks. Dates stretched back nearly 15 years. Each volume was labeled carefully. Weather, bird migration, water levels, wildlife sightings. The handwriting was precise, orderly, disciplined. The work of someone patient enough to observe details most people overlooked. One notebook fell open near the middle. A single sentence had been underlined twice. Protecting something begins with noticing it. Mason read it again, then again. The words carried no drama, no grand philosophy, yet they felt deeply personal, the kind of lesson earned through years rather than taught through speeches. For reasons he couldn't explain, he copied the sentence onto a scrap of paper, then folded it into his pocket. The afternoon sun had begun sinking when another vehicle appeared on the narrow trail. An old pickup truck rolled to a stop nearby. The driver climbed out slowly, tall, thin, white-haired. He wore a heavy blue coat and carried himself with the calm confidence of someone long accustomed to difficult weather. The man noticed Atlas immediately. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like he still remembers the way." Atlas rose to his feet, not excited, not energetic, yet noticeably attentive. The stranger smiled. "You must be Mason Crow." Mason frowned. "Have we met?" The man extended a hand. "Samuel Reed." The name meant nothing at first. Then recognition surfaced. Martha had mentioned him once, the retired veterinarian, one of Warren's oldest friends. His handshake was gentle but steady. The kind of handshake that belonged to someone who spent decades caring for fragile things. Samuel glanced around the shed. His eyes softened. He kept it exactly the way Warren liked it. "You've been here before," the veterinarian chuckled. "Hundreds of times." He looked toward Atlas, then toward the notebooks, then out across the frozen landscape. For a brief moment sadness crossed his face. Not sharp sadness, the quieter kind, the kind that arrives after years of acceptance. Warren used to say this was the most important room in Cedar Hollow. Mason looked around the tiny structure. "It doesn't seem like much." Samuel nodded. "That's exactly why most people never understood him." The old veterinarian fell silent, and for the first time, Mason felt he had finally found someone willing to speak honestly about Warren Doyle. Samuel Reed was not the kind of man who rushed through a story. Over the next several days, Mason learned that quickly. The retired veterinarian spoke the way some people repaired watches, carefully, patiently, with respect for every small piece. Whenever Mason visited the field station, Samuel would often already be there. Sometimes he was reviewing Warren's notebooks, sometimes checking trail cameras, sometimes simply sitting beside the window with a cup of coffee while Atlas slept nearby. The old German shepherd seemed completely comfortable around him. More comfortable than around anyone else. One morning, Samuel scratched behind Atlas's folded ear. The dog closed his eyes briefly. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet it revealed years of trust. "How long did you know him?" Mason asked. "Warren," Samuel smiled faintly. "Almost 30 years. That long? Long enough to argue with him." Mason laughed. Samuel laughed too. Believe me, everyone argued with Warren. Eventually, the answer surprised Mason. Until now, most people had spoken about Warren in vague terms. Samuel spoke about him like a real person, a flawed one, a stubborn one, a complicated one. And somehow that made Mason respect him more. As winter slowly loosened its grip on Cedar Hollow, Mason began spending less time sorting his parents' house and more time learning about the land surrounding the lake. Samuel guided him through old maps, survey records, wildlife reports, conservation studies. The amount of work Warren had completed was staggering. For years he had documented migration routes, nesting grounds, water levels, and seasonal changes. Entire shelves were filled with observations, thousands of pages, thousands of hours. One afternoon, Mason finally asked the question that had been bothering him. If Warren cared this much, why does everybody act like he was some kind of troublemaker? Samuel's smile disappeared. Not angrily, sadly, because people usually notice opposition before they notice intentions. What does that mean? The old veterinarian leaned back. Outside the window, snowmelt dripped from pine branches. Warren spent years objecting to development projects because of the wildlife. Usually. Mason nodded slowly. That made sense. But it also explained part of the town's discomfort. People remembered arguments more easily than motivations. A week later, Mason encountered the argument for himself. Not in a meeting, not in a newspaper, but standing beside the lake. He had spent the morning following Atlas through one of his regular routes. The dog moved slower these days. The stiffness in his hips became more noticeable whenever he climbed a slope. Yet he never skipped a stop, never shortened the route. By noon, they reached a stretch of shoreline where survey markers protruded from the snow. Several trucks were parked nearby. Men in reflective jackets moved equipment between vehicles. A temporary sign stood near the road, proposed Cedar Rigid Development Project. Mason studied it for a moment. Then a voice spoke behind him. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" He turned. The speaker appeared roughly his age, maybe a little older. Tall, athletic, clean-shaven. A charcoal overcoat covered a dress shirt despite the cold. Unlike most people in Cedar Hollow, he carried himself with the energy of someone still chasing deadlines. The man extended a hand. Logan Pierce. Mason Crow. Recognition flickered across Logan's face. "The Navy guy." Mason smiled. "I've been called worse." Logan laughed. The sound came easily, naturally, nothing forced about it. "This project belongs to my company." Mason glanced toward the survey equipment. "I figured." The two men stood quietly for a moment, watching workers move across the frozen landscape. Then Logan surprised him. "You knew Warren Doyle?" Mason hesitated. "Not exactly. I did." That wasn't the answer Mason expected. Logan studied the shoreline. He fought this project for years. There was no bitterness in his voice, no resentment, only simple acknowledgement, like discussing weather. "Did you dislike him?" Logan shook his head. "Actually, no." The answer genuinely surprised Mason. "Really? Most people assume we hated each other." The developer smiled. "Warren thought I was wrong, and so did plenty of people." The man shoved his hands into his coat pockets, but he always showed up prepared. That evening, Mason couldn't stop thinking about the conversation, because it didn't fit the narrative he had expected. In stories, conflicts were usually simple. One side right, one side wrong. One side protecting, one side destroying. Reality rarely cooperated. The next day he returned to the field station and shared the encounter with Samuel. The old veterinarian listened quietly, then nodded. "That sounds like Logan. You know him." "Of course." Samuel closed one of Warren's notebooks. "Good man." Mason frowned. "Then why were they always fighting?" Samuel smiled. "Because both men cared about Cedar Hollow." The answer felt frustratingly incomplete. Seeing Mason's expression, Samuel continued, "Logan wants jobs. That isn't unreasonable. No, he wants younger families to stay. Also not unreasonable." Samuel pointed toward the window, "And Warren wanted those birds to keep returning every spring." Mason followed his gaze. Several geese moved across the distant shoreline, tiny black shapes against the melting snow. For a long moment neither man spoke. Then Samuel said quietly, "The problem wasn't that one of them loved Cedar Hollow. It was that both of them did." The statement lingered, long after the conversation ended. A few days later, the town council held an open community discussion regarding future development around the lake. Mason attended mostly out of curiosity. The community center filled quickly. Farmers, retirees, business owners, teachers, people who had lived there for generations, others who had arrived only recently. The atmosphere remained respectful, but tension existed beneath the surface. Everyone could feel it. Logan stood before the room and presented plans, new jobs, expanded tourism, infrastructure improvements, economic projections. The numbers were impressive. Many residents seemed encouraged. Then another speaker displayed photographs of nesting habitats near the northern wetlands, environmental reports, migration corridors, wildlife studies. Many of the documents carried Warren Doyle's name. Even after death, he was still participating in the discussion, still influencing decisions, still refusing to disappear. At one point, Mason glanced around the room. People weren't arguing about money, or birds, or land. Not really. They were arguing about the future. What kind of town Cedar Hollow wanted to become? What was worth keeping? What was worth changing? For the first time, Mason began understanding the true size of the conflict Warren had spent years fighting. After the meeting ended, darkness had already fallen. Snowmelt dripped from rooftops. The first signs of spring lingered in the cold air. Atlas waited beside Mason's truck. The old dog had remained outside during the gathering, patient as always. Mason opened the passenger door. Atlas didn't climb in. Instead, he stood looking toward the lake, toward the wetlands beyond, toward the places he still visited every week, the places Warren had spent years documenting, protecting, watching. Mason stepped beside him. For several minutes, neither moved. The dog wasn't waiting for commands. He wasn't asking for anything. He was simply looking, as if making sure those places still existed, as if checking whether someone else had finally started paying attention. And for the first time, Mason realized he no longer felt like a visitor in Warren's story. He had become part of the conversation, not because Warren had saved his life, not because of Atlas, but because the questions Warren left behind now belonged to everyone, including him. Spring arrived slowly in Cedar Hollow, not with warmth. Not at first. It arrived through small changes. The lake ice began breaking apart near the shoreline. Patches of brown grass appeared between islands of snow. The air smelled different, less like winter, more like wet earth preparing to wake. For most people in town, the season meant looking forward. For Mason, it meant looking backward. The closer he came to understanding Warren Doyle, the more he realized how little he actually knew. The notebooks explained what Warren had done. They did not explain who he had been. Those were different questions, and the second one mattered more. One afternoon, Samuel handed Mason a cardboard file box. The two men sat inside the field station while rain tapped softly against the roof. "What is this?" Samuel pushed the box across the table. "The things Warren left behind at the Veterans Care Center." Mason looked up. "He lived there?" "For his last 18 months. The answer landed heavily. Until that moment, Warren's absence had felt abstract. Now it became personal, physical. The realization that there had been hospital rooms, doctor visits, long nights, pain, a real ending to a real life. Samuel removed his glasses. He didn't talk much about being sick. Why? Samuel smiled sadly. Because he hated being the center of attention. That sounded exactly like the man Mason had been piecing together. The box contained notebooks, correspondence, receipts, and a handful of photographs. Nothing dramatic, nothing secret. Just the ordinary remains of a life. Yet Mason found himself studying every item carefully, as though searching for the spaces between the words. Several evenings later, Mason sat alone at his parents' kitchen table. A lamp cast a pool of light across the documents. Outside, rainwater dripped from the gutters. Atlas slept near the back door. Not beside the abandoned house anymore, not every night. Sometimes he still returned there. Sometimes he stayed with Mason. The gradual change had happened so naturally that neither seemed to notice. Mason opened a thin folder labeled medical records. Most of it was routine, appointments, treatments, prescriptions. Then he found something unexpected, a request form. Under emergency contacts, Warren had listed only 2 names, Samuel Reed and Atlas. Mason stared at the page. Atlas wasn't technically a person, yet Warren had written the dog's name anyway. Not as a joke, not sentimentally, as though he genuinely considered Atlas family. The realization stayed with Mason long after he closed the folder. Because suddenly, the old German Shepherd felt less like a companion, and more like the last witness to an entire chapter of someone's life. The next morning, Mason visited Hank Morales. The older veteran was repairing a wooden bird feeder on his porch. Tools lay scattered around him. Fresh sawdust clung to his jacket. When Mason mentioned Warren's final years, Hank became unusually quiet. For a while he continued sanding the wood. Then he set the tool down. "I should have visited him." Mason said nothing. Hank stared across the yard. "I kept telling myself there'd be time." Regret entered his voice again, different from before, more exposed, more honest. By the time I finally called, he'd already been transferred. The old man rubbed his hands together. "Funny thing about pride. What? It always feels important until it isn't." The sentence lingered, simple, painful, true. For the first time, Hank spoke openly about their falling out, not the details, just the cost. Years lost. Conversations never had. Apologies never offered, the kind of losses that couldn't be measured. Mason left that afternoon carrying a strange weight. Not Warren's, his own. Because he knew exactly how easy it was to postpone important things. Until there wasn't time left. A week later, Samuel invited Mason to accompany him to the Veterans Care Center where Warren had spent his final months. The facility sat nearly 2 hours away, a quiet brick building surrounded by pine trees. Nothing about it looked remarkable, which somehow made the visit harder, because ordinary places often contained extraordinary endings. A nurse recognized Warren's name immediately. Her expression softened. "I remember him." The answer surprised Mason. The woman smiled. "Everyone did. Warren talked a lot." Samuel laughed. The nurse laughed too. "Not even close. Then why remember him?" The woman thought for a moment, then pointed toward a window overlooking the parking lot. Every afternoon he sat right there. Mason followed her gaze. He'd watch people arrive. Family visits? Sometimes. The nurse smiled faintly, but mostly birds. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The image felt perfectly consistent with everything else. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. The woman continued. "He used to tell us which species would arrive before they actually showed up." Samuel nodded knowingly. "That sounds like Warren." The nurse opened a drawer and retrieved a small digital recorder. "We kept this." Mason frowned. "What is it?" Voice notes. His heartbeat slowed. Not excitement, something gentler. something closer to anticipation, a chance to hear the voice behind all the stories. Back at the field station, they listened together. The recording quality was poor. Static crackled occasionally. Long pauses separated many entries. Warren's voice sounded older than Mason expected, rough, measured, comfortable with silence. Most recordings contained observations about weather, bird migrations, water conditions, the ordinary things he always cared about. Then one entry stopped Mason cold. The date was only 6 months before Warren's death. The recording began with several seconds of silence. Then Warren spoke. "If Atlas is still making the rounds." Another pause. Longer this time. Then somebody's paying attention. The room became very still. Mason looked toward Samuel. The old veterinarian stared at the floor, not because the words were shocking, because they felt intimate. Like overhearing a private thought, Warren continued, "I don't need anybody remembering me." A cough interrupted him, then another. When he spoke again, his voice sounded weaker. "Just don't stop noticing what's here." The recording ended. No grand speech, no final message, no attempt at legacy. Just a simple request. Notice, pay attention, care enough to look. That evening Mason returned to the abandoned house alone. Atlas stood near the porch, watching the sunset. The dog looked older than when Mason first met him. Not weaker, just older, as though time had finally begun catching up. Mason rested one hand against the fence. For a long moment neither moved. Then Atlas walked forward. Not halfway, not cautiously. All the way. The old German shepherd stopped beside the fence directly in front of him, close enough to touch. This time, Mason slowly reached out. Atlas didn't retreat, didn't hesitate. His weathered muzzle rested briefly against Mason's hand. Only a few seconds, yet it felt like the end of something. Or perhaps the beginning. Mason scratched gently behind the folded ear, the same spot Samuel always used. Atlas closed his eyes, not because he mistook Mason for Warren, because trust had finally arrived. And standing there beneath the fading light, Mason understood something he had been missing all along. The town thought Warren spent his life trying to save a wetland, or protect birds, or stop construction. But that wasn't the whole truth. Warren had spent his life trying to convince people to notice things before they disappeared. And perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't that he had died. It was that so few people had understood him while he was alive. By late April, Cedar Hollow no longer looked like a town recovering from winter. It looked like a town deciding what came next. The lake had opened completely. The last sheets of ice had vanished from the northern coves. Migrating birds returned in growing numbers each week. People noticed them now, not everyone. But more than before, Mason saw it happening. Conversations in diners, comments after town meetings, visitors stopping near observation points Warren had documented years earlier. The change was subtle, yet real, like the first green shoots pushing through soil after a long season underground. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Hollow, Mason felt something unexpected. Hope, not certainty, hope. The town council spent most of spring reviewing revised proposals for the Cedar Ridge project. Logan Pierce had done something many people hadn't expected. He listened, not to everyone. That would have been impossible. But enough. Sections of the original plan changed. Several building sites were relocated. Protected buffer zones expanded. Wetland access restrictions increased. Environmental monitoring became part of the agreement. Nobody received everything they wanted, which, according to Samuel, usually meant progress. One afternoon, the three men stood together overlooking the shoreline. Logan held a rolled blueprint beneath one arm. Samuel carried binoculars. Mason carried nothing. For a while they watched a flock of geese settle across the water. Then Logan spoke. Warren would have still complained. Samuel laughed immediately. So would you. Probably. The developer smiled. But he'd have appreciated the effort. Samuel considered that, then nodded. Yes, it was the closest thing to a peace agreement Mason had ever witnessed between two men who had spent years standing on opposite sides of an argument. As the season changed, so did Atlas. The old German shepherd still insisted on making his rounds, but they took longer now, sometimes much longer. He rested more frequently, paused beneath trees, stopped beside fallen logs, sat quietly near the shoreline before continuing. Mason never rushed him. The route had become part of his own life as well. Every morning they walked together. Not owner and dog. Not yet. Something harder to define. Two aging souls sharing responsibilities neither had chosen. One morning, Atlas stopped beside the old field station. The building looked brighter beneath the spring sunlight. Wildflowers had begun appearing near the trail. The dog sat near the entrance, watching the landscape, watching the wetlands, watching everything Warren had spent years protecting. Mason sat beside him. The silence felt comfortable. Then something unusual happened. Atlas didn't look toward the lake. He looked at Mason, held the gaze, then rested his head gently against Mason's knee. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just trust, simple and complete. Mason placed a hand on the dog's neck. Neither moved for a long time. And somewhere inside him, a decision quietly settled into place. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply certain. He was not selling his parents' house. The realization surprised him. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt right. For the first time in years, the official vote occurred 3 weeks later. The community center filled again. Many of the same faces returned, some hopeful, some skeptical, most simply tired. Years of debate had worn everyone down. Mason sat near the back beside Samuel. Atlas slept at their feet. Logan stood near the front. When the final results were announced, applause spread through the room. Not thunderous applause, relieved applause. The revised project passed. The protected wetlands remained intact. A significant portion of the northern habitat would become a permanent conservation area. Development would move forward. So would preservation. Nobody had won completely. Nobody had lost completely. For Cedar Hollow, that might have been the best outcome possible. Mason looked around the room. People smiled, shook hands, disagreed, continued discussing details. Life moved forward. That, more than anything else, felt important. Later that evening, he drove to the abandoned house. The property looked different now, not because it had changed, because he had. The rusted fence remained, the peeling paint remained, the porch still leaned slightly to one side, yet the place no longer felt haunted, only quiet. Atlas stepped from the truck and walked toward the backyard. Mason followed. The old dog reached the familiar spot near the back steps, the place where everything had begun, the place where he had waited through storms, through seasons, through loneliness, through more than a year of uncertainty. For several minutes Atlas stood there, looking at the door, the same door he had watched every day, the same door he had refused to abandon. Mason remained silent. Some moments deserved silence. Then Atlas did something he had never done before. He turned away, not briefly, not by accident, completely. The dog looked toward Mason, then toward the road, then back toward Mason, as if making a choice, a simple one, yet somehow enormous. The old German shepherd walked past him, past the fence, past the property line. Without looking back, Mason felt an unexpected tightness in his throat, because he understood. Not with certainty, not logically, but emotionally. Atlas wasn't forgetting Warren. He wasn't abandoning him. The watch was simply over. Summer arrived early that year. The mornings became warmer. The trails busier. Birdsong returned to places that had seemed silent all winter. Mason settled into a routine that no longer felt temporary. He repaired sections of his parents' house, helped Samuel maintain observation records, attended town meetings, shared coffee with Hank. argued politely with Logan. Little by little, Cedar Hollow stopped feeling like a place he had returned to. It became a place he belonged, and Atlas became part of that life. Every morning they still walked, many of the same routes, many of the same stops. The difference was subtle, yet meaningful. Atlas no longer led the journey. Sometimes he looked to Mason before choosing a direction. Sometimes he followed. Sometimes they simply wandered. The old routine had transformed into something new, a partnership rather than a duty. One evening near sunset, Mason stood beside the lake. Atlas rested in the grass nearby. The water reflected gold and silver beneath the fading sky. A breeze moved gently across the shoreline. For a while, neither man nor dog moved. Then Mason looked toward the distant wetlands, the protected land, the nesting grounds, the places Warren had spent years defending. They would never belong entirely to one person. That had never been the point. The point was that somebody cared enough to notice, to pay attention, to keep showing up. He thought about Warren, about Samuel, about Hank, about Logan, about all the people who had misunderstood one another while still loving the same town. Then he looked down at Atlas. The old German shepherd opened one eye, satisfied, peaceful, home. Mason smiled. The dog had spent years standing guard over a memory. Now he no longer needed to, because the things Warren cared about were no longer being carried by one aging dog. They were being carried by an entire community. And as the evening light settled across Cedar Hollow, the last watch finally came to an end. Sometimes healing doesn't happen when we finally get answers. Sometimes it happens when we choose to carry forward what was worth loving. Atlas spent years standing watch over a memory. In the end, he wasn't waiting for the past to return. He was waiting for someone to care enough to continue the journey. Maybe that's true in our own lives, too. The people we miss may be gone, but the kindness they showed, the values they lived by, and the lives they touched can still move forward through us. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories of loyalty, faith, and second chances, please consider subscribing to the channel. May God grant you peace for what you've lost, gratitude for what remains, and the wisdom to notice the quiet blessings that are still around you every day. Until next time, take care.